Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Celebrating Will Eisner's The Spirit at 80 panel. Yes, it is 8 decades since Will Eisner unleashed Denny Colt on the world, and we are here. I'm Danny Fingeroth, and I'm here with a bunch of amazing people who knew and or loved and or admired and or worked with Will. So I was an editor and writer at Marvel Comics for many years. I worked running the Spider-Man line, and I have written books about comics, including Superman on the Couch, disguised as Clark Kent. My latest book, which I may mention a couple of times during the panel, is a biography of Stan Lee. It's called The Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. It's from St. Martin's Press, and it's available in hardcover, soon in paperback, and there's an audio book. So if you like hearing me now, imagine 14 hours of this. And I'm also the chair of Will Eisner Week, which is an annual celebration of Will Eisner and the spirit and everything he's done. And if you want to know more about that, you can contact me at danny@dannyfingeroth.com. Let us get to our panelists. In the order that they're up in the little boxes on top of my screen, Mr. Dennis Kitchen. Dennis, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about your relationship with Will, please.
Well, I wear a few hats. I started as a cartoonist. I was a publisher for many years with Kitchen Sink, and now I'm also a literary agent and an author and a book packager. I met Will when I was a very young publisher. In fact, next year will mark the 50th anniversary of my meeting Will. Wow. And that led to my convincing him that The Spirit should be reprinted, which he was dubious about, but it worked out.
Apparently. Thank you. And the next little box on the top of my screen is Dan Schady. Help me out there.
Schady, rhymes with body.
I meant to say Dan Schady, who recently drew a spirit miniseries. Tell us about your background and how a youth like yourself came to be aware of the spirit. Well, we'll go into more of that later, but just a little bit about your background and what you did with the spirit.
Sure. Well, I'm a cartoonist. My first big gig in comics was doing the Spirit 75th anniversary series from Dynamite that was written by Matt Wagner and colored by Brendan Wagner. And it was sort of like a little tour through the Spirit universe for new readers. You know, we met all the big femme fatales. You know, he fought the octopus, he fought Carrion, and got tied up and blown up, and all the things we love about Denny Colt. And it fit my interest perfectly because I've just always really I've been to the Spirit since I was a teenager. I'm kind of known in comics as being the young guy who likes old stuff. And but part of what I love about that old stuff is just that it's so evocative and dynamic. That's why it's still around. And so now I'm doing comics through Webtoon, which is sort of the closest a modern person could get to doing weekly newspaper strips.
True.
Outside of doing the weekly newspaper strips that are left, I guess.
With the same relaxing deadlines, I guess, right?
Oh yeah, luxurious.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome. And last but by no means least is Mr. Paul Levitz. Paul, you've been in comics for a while.
Been at it a while. Yeah. You know, the gray hair is even more obvious from 3 months of being locked in a room and just growing wildly. New York City supposedly is going to have barbershops available next week, and I'm sitting there just thrilled with the idea of somebody taking a lawnmower to my head because it's
right, while you both are masked, so that'll be interesting for the sideburns, you know.
Yeah, the mask might come off for a little bit of trim here or there.
So for those two people in the audience who don't know much about you, what have you done, and specifically what have you done relating to Will?
So I spent most of my career at DC Comics, writing, editing, running the business under a bunch of different titles. And as part of that, getting to be the publisher of the Spirit Archives when Will's reprint rights became available. Project that I was thrilled that we managed to bring to complete conclusion, so that material could be available for libraries and for my own personal collection, since I hadn't never completed amassing a set of the Spirit sections. After I left the desk, I took up teaching because it's a wonderful opportunity to poison young people's minds, and still do some writing. And part of the writing I did was to do a book on Will, focusing on his role in the evolution of the graphic novel. Will Eisner, champion of the graphic novel, still available from Abrams. Plenty of copies sitting there, growing penicillin on them, that would look much better in your home library and be available as an emergency medication in your home. All you would have to do is sort of lick the penicillin off the cover.
I thought you meant hitting somebody over the head with it, but
It's useful for that too. Abrams does beautiful, solid books, and I count myself as a friend of Will and Anne, as well as a fan and admirer of his work.
well, thank you. All right, so I'm going to go into, like I said, a history of mostly the Spirit, some other Will stuff, and some other extraneous materials. So this will be so slick and so technologically elegant, you won't even notice it's happening. Travis, help me out here. Okay, let me. All right,
you've got sharing permission.
Now I got to go to screen share. Okay, this, share. And now I go to view slide. There you go. Pretty slick, huh, guys?
It is kind of appropriate. This is the most 80 years after 1940 panel we could have possibly had.
Yes. And yet there's a painting of the Spirit by Will running on. That's a very dangerous elevated subway track. It doesn't seem to actually be architecturally connected to a whole lot, but okay.
I don't see any support there, but it works.
If you look in the background, like under the, I'm pointing to my screen, like you can see, there's some, I guess a nod to reality, but no, it wouldn't hold up very well. But we're celebrating 80 years of Will Eisner's The Spirit, and here's our names for when you want to send us checks or crank mail. And special thanks to Dr. Travis Langley. And this is young Will Eisner with hair, not implants, not a toupee, actual Will with hair. So this must be, I think this is from a photo shoot from the early 40s.
1940, exactly.
It is so right at the beginning of The Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Just for a little background, these are other people born in 1917, the same year as Will. That's Robert Mitchum, Dean Martin, and John Lee Hooker. So if you can imagine all the three of them and Will at lunch, that would be an interesting meal to eavesdrop on. This guy was born, Jack Kirby, born the same year as Will. And this guy, John F. Kennedy. Bob Dylan just wrote a song about him. So always, these were Will's, not contemporaries in the sense that he hung out with them, but that's the era Will was from. And this is, somebody help me.
Lynn Ward.
Lynn Ward, the God's Man. These are some of Will's influences. An artist named Lynn Ward, whose work is now available again after decades of nobody seeing it. An incredible artist that Will was very influenced by. Will was influenced by people like photographer Man Ray, who did a lot of experimental and dramatic things with photography. This is one of Man Ray's famous photos. This is the Harvard or Yale of comics. This is DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, which is where Will went to high school. Erwin Hazen, who co-created the Green Lantern and Wildcat, Bill Finger and Bob Kane, who co-created Batman, on and on and on, in many different fields, not just comics. This was and still is in the North Bronx. And this is some of Will's work for the yearbook at DeWitt Clinton High School. He was the the main artist for the yearbook. That's another guy who went to do with Clinton. That's Stan Lee from his high school yearbook. This is as we talked about, that's Bob Kane on the left and Bill Finger. Used to be the only picture we had of Bill Finger. There are many more now, but it's still a cool picture. And they, of course, were the two guys who came up with Batman. Will Eisner graduates high school, and he runs into Bob Kane, who is doing work for this Wow, What a Magazine. That was such a wow that it lasted, what, 4 issues? But it was kind of a hybrid of comics and prose. And Kane suggested that Eisner go to meet this guy, Jerry Iger, who was publishing the magazine. And Eisner helped him out of a spot, and they ended up becoming a business partners and creative partners. And with Jerry Iger, Will did a lot of different work and a lot of different styles. They packaged a lot of material, and often Will would use pen names. He'd sign stuff Will Eisner, and you can see he always practiced that Disney-like W. But to make it seem like they had more than just one artist on staff, Will would use names like Willis Renzi for Hawks of the Sea. When he created Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, he signed it as W. Morgan Thomas. So Will was becoming a name and a known quantity and someone who was dependable. Anybody have anything to add or correct or?
Well, on that previous page of the Hawks in the Sea, there's a panel. It's panel, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where you're looking up through this opening looking at a guy standing, right. the netting sort of going up in the background. That's such an early Will panel.
Yeah,
like that sort of extreme worm's eye. He was going crazy with it right from the beginning.
Yep.
Well, yeah, very, very, very cinematically influenced. You can see it in all this. Thank you. And this is Sheena. This is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who, of course, in 1938, through DC Comics, brought the world Superman, which started the superhero craze. Batman, of course, by Kane and Finger was the follow-up, and the whole slew, all those golden age superheroes we know. And that is when a newspaper syndicate wanted to get in on that action of comic books and package a comic it was the Register and Tribune Syndicate, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, and so they asked Eisner, who had become known as both creative and dependable, to come up with a superhero insert. The problem was Will hated superheroes. So the compromise was the Spirit, who was Denny Colt, who ended up being dead, then in suspended animation, then came back to life. This is the first page of the very first Spirit section. So Eisner got together a studio full of artists. Everybody went through that studio: Jack Kirby, Al Jaffe, Jack Cole, anybody who worked in that era worked for Eisner. And so they put out what's called the Spirit section, the comic book section, in not that many papers, right? Dennis, how many papers was the Spirit in?
All we have are a list of papers it did appear in. It wasn't a huge number. You could count it in the 20s, not the hundreds. But the cumulative circulation exceeded 5 million, I know, at its height.
Incredible, yeah. And Will, Will was eager for that. He gave up what had been a pretty comfortable thing with Eisner and Iger to go out on his own and do this, because he really wanted to appeal to an all ages audience, but certainly to adults more than comics were traditionally thought of. And so, he became.
Danny, before you keep on the Spirit,
Sure.
Just a brief amendation.
Amend away.
Some of the names you mentioned did indeed work for the studio, but they worked, like Kirby. Jack worked for Eisner and Iger in the studio period, not for Eisner's studio doing the Spirit later on.
Good point. Thank you.
by the time the Spirit launches, Kirby is already off with Joe Simon,
Right.
doing Captain America and ultimately creating half the universe with a variety of different collaborators. But
that's a really important point. I mean, it's sort of, sometimes in my mind it gets blurred who worked for him at what point, but yeah.
I mean, one of the consistent things is that Will was an extraordinary talent scout and an extraordinary leader of talent, so that both in the Eisner and Iger period and in his own studio when he was packaging the Spirit material, he really brought together some people who had incredible talent on their own and would use it solo in other venues, and made terrific contributions that he blended together into the personal style that he executed within his own studio. But it's important to remember the distinctions of the two periods, because the result of them is very different.
Right. No, you should write a book about that.
Been there, done that.
Okay. Anyway, so this is what I get for bringing people smarter than me onto the panel. I have to learn not to do that next time, you know. So the Spirit became known for for many things, but among them were having a unique and very attention-getting splash page, because it's really the cover. It was like the cover of a comic book. And I guess if you'd bought the newspaper, you'd already bought it, but this really, you know, added emphasis and got, you know, made sure that the comic section would have as much attention as possible. This is what's called the style is a little more realistic, I suppose, than the early of the Spirits. This is still from the first year. This is August 1940. So I'm just gonna, you can see there's a different design, and I think what drove some business-minded people crazy was that the logo was different every issue. So it took a long time for them to come up with a trademarkable logo. So you can see again the cinematic influence, a lot of German expressionist cinema and Wells, who we'll get to in a minute. You know, this is supposed to be Eisner himself, and it's called Self-Portrait. Although I don't know if Will actually fully. Was this inked by Lou Fine? Somebody must know. Okay.
You know that you included that splash page in one of your Eisner Week posters, and I've got that poster hanging above my desk.
Oh, it's a great shot.
Oh, it's very motivational, and it's nice knowing that he had the same deadline anxieties that I do.
Yeah, where's the Spirit, the editor? Right?
Yeah, I think that's Will. I think that's Will himself, Danny. Before the assistants took over.
Mm. It's pretty. I mean, that's a tough. That angle is tough to pull off, you know. So I'm not going to dwell on every one, but just sort of want to give you an array. This is one of the most famous ones. It's Meet Piguel. I am Piguel, and this is not the story for little boys. That's my last French accent for the day, by the way. I won't do any more. You know, this might be the most well-known piece of Eisner art. You know, that just anybody who knows at all about Will. And this is from the Chicago Sun. I think from '46. This is one I think called The Building or The Apartment, but there's the Spirit logo as a building. We're talking about Orson Welles. This is, you know, a lot of people from that generation, but certainly Will were influenced by Welles and in general, and Citizen Kane in particular. So here's Orson Welles as Charles Foster Kane amid, you know, the newspapers of his newspaper empire. If anybody there needs to look up what a newspaper is, that's what the internet is for. There's another shot from Citizen Kane, very Eisnerian, with the extreme angle and the logo and the logo on the top. I just wanted, it's a sequence sort of stills from Citizen Kane, and where, again, a famous sequence where we come to the club sign and we see through the skylight where Kane's widow is speaking to a reporter. And, you know, then we have this Spirit story called The Job, where, you know, if not consciously, certainly subconsciously, it seems to me Will was trying to do something like that, seeing through a skylight. This is a story called Black Alley, which again, Will loved the city. Will was really a creature of New York. He grew up, I guess, was born in Brooklyn, mostly grew up in the Bronx, had a studio in Tudor City. And, you know, he loved just the shadows and the architecture of the city. This is a page from that same story where he, in 9 panels, has this incredible kinetic action going on. And, you know, it's not just a chase, but it's, look, a chase. It's the cop, the spirit. And even though we know the spirit is the good guy, Will does the page from the point of view of the common man, you know, of the just the bystander looking out the window who sees somebody being chased and assumes the person chasing them is the bad guy. You know, this kind of echoes with current events a little, you know, a little surreally. Anybody have any observations or thoughts about this page or Will's work in general? Okay.
Well, one thing that's great about the way he constructs action sequences like this is his version of New York, you know, his central city, is so compact. Like there's never like a building so far apart from the next one that you can't leap across it. There's always like gangways and laundry lines or a train line right outside the window like this, and it makes everything feel sometimes cozy, sometimes claustrophobic, but never empty.
Yeah, it's just it's incredible.
Yeah, you could do a class just on this page on storytelling.
You really could.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing. And this is Jules Feiffer, who a young Jules Feiffer, needless to say, although not quite. He came on to be Eisner. He came to Eisner's studio and became an assistant. Talked his way into the job really in 1947, I believe. So this is probably more like 1960. But that's Feiffer and Eisner's careers sort of at times would be intertwined and have almost a conversation between each other. This is the New Year's story from you know, New Year's Eve 1950. It's called Deadline, and the premise is Eisner has to come to work on New Year's Eve because he's so behind in deadlines. And while he's there, his assistant, who is basically Jules, comes and assassinates him and takes over the strip. I have to say, you know, I have a feeling this is a collaboration between Jules and Will, but you cannot accuse Jules of vanity because he does not look, you know, this might be Eisner's revenge for Jules nagging him or something, but that's really not, you know, if you've ever seen Jules Feiffer, he's quite a bit better looking than this, but Will had no compunction. I guess if Will was going to get killed in the strip, then Jules had to not look quite so heroic. And then this is the punchline, or part of the punchline, where Jules have been doing a satiric, a humor strip called Clifford. And so this is Clifford as the spirit. I must be the spirit and I must never carry a gun, but still I must fight crime barehanded. No other crime fighter can make that stupid statement. So this was, they're working together. And this is one of their, a story that Feiffer wrote, although he always is quick to credit Will as sort of him, as almost him channeling Will to write it. But it's a very famous spirit story called 10 Minutes. And, you know, what is 10 minutes in a man's life? Well, duh, it's the most important 10 minutes in the man's life. And so it's a very New York, very Jewish story. This about this down on his luck young man who decides he's going to rob the beloved owner of the neighborhood candy store and ends up accidentally killing him. Spoiler alert, but it is at 75 years, so you know, if you haven't read it, too bad. And so this is Will kind of at his peak. Any thoughts on the? And here's some more stories. Any thoughts on Will and Jules, or just Will in this period?
Well, I think, you know, what you touched on a little bit, Danny. When Will comes back from the army, he serves in a communications unit. But he comes back a much more mature person, both in terms of the art itself, his interactions with people around him, and his worldview. We're going through this grand debate in the last couple of weeks on things like Gone with the Wind. Should those be shown? How do you put it in historical perspective? Well, the pre-war spirit has many of those issues in the character Ebony,
Right.
who is very much a minstrel show sort of character. And when we went to reprint the Spirit material, we thought heavily about the issue of how to put that in historical perspective, because the archives were going to be, expensive, fancy hardcover books that were intended either for libraries or serious collectors. We weren't concerned about it getting in the hands of an 8-year-old kid without explanation, where it might be problematic on one level or another. But Will comes back after the war a different person, and the cast that he depicts in the Spirit becomes more diverse. The way he works with people becomes more powerful. When you talk about Jules's collaboration, or any of the collaborations that he has in the period from 46 to 50 or 51, when he really starts fading out of doing work hands-on on the strip as much, he takes these brilliantly talented people, or these narrowly talented people, and he pulls them together and guides them in a fashion where it really is an artist's atelier. It is a studio that produces a consistent product that feels like it's all from his hand. And to hear Jules, maybe the most diversely awarded and celebrated cartoonist we've had in the field in the last 100 years, having won virtually every award you could possibly win, well outside the traditional awards that cartoonists win, describe the work as being, no, that's still Will. Right. Never mind that I wrote it, but Will's hand is holding my hand. Testimony to that really unique thing that happened here. And we've never really seen that happen in collaborative comics to this extent. The studio included people who were hired for very specific skills. A young Jerry Grandinetti is hired to draw backgrounds because he'd been an architecture student. And theoretically, that means he should be able to draw really good straight lines and interesting buildings and this and that. He matures and he becomes a cartoonist who really is as evocative of the wildest moments that Will was capable of, and then some in his career. Pfeiffer comes in as a 16-year-old, good only for sweeping the floors and maybe erasing the backgrounds of pages after they've been inked. He grows into a writer. He grows into an incredible cartoonist himself and a great satirist, both as a writer and as an artist. So there's something going on in those years that is Will the teacher. He wouldn't become nominally a teacher for another 25 years, roughly, but he's already teaching. He becomes an artist with the ability to use other people as part of his art in a way that very, very few in our field ever have. And it's worth diverging a little bit just to touch on that, I think.
Oh no, definitely. Yeah, no, it was one of those magical things where, again, it would have been nice to be a fly on the wall there.
Yeah, it was funny to me that even in their later years, they would have friendly arguments about who wrote what. Because this story, for example, Jules insisted he wrote it, Will insisted he wrote it.
Oh, is that true? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was probably collaborative. But what I thought was best when they were interviewed in later years, Pfeiffer said that even when he was a lowly assistant, he wasn't treated as a lowly assistant. He was treated as an equal. And he said when he came up with an idea, Will listened to it respectfully. And whether he used it or not, he never was dismissive. And he always encouraged Jules to do his best. And that in itself is unusual in a studio relationship. I mean, we touched briefly on Bob Kane, who was the exact opposite. So it's a great dynamic, and as you say, it's a classic period in the Spirit and early in Jules' career.
Well, and I'll get to this again later, but Jules just recently did a trilogy of graphic novels, and very, with a lot of homage to Will, and he spoke of sort of feeling like he had Will looking over his shoulder, or even almost sitting on his shoulder, like a Jiminy Cricket, as he was doing the whole trilogy.
Wow.
So this is another story that Pfeiffer wrote, and it's drawn by Wally Wood. This was near the end. This is, I think, just about the strip ended in '52, and this is September. So this might have been the last. Was this the Return to the Moon, the last storyline?
I think it ended the next month.
So this was just but still, the splash pages, even with Will's minimal participation, was still very interesting and compelling. This is Will's own, what he always referred to as his own favorite Spirit story, the story of Gerhard Schnabel, about a young man who discovers as a kid that he can fly, but his parents and teachers, beat that idea out of him, and they insist he can't fly, and even if he could, he never should. And this is, I think, this must be a pretty early experiment with art and photography about the kid describing he could fly, and that whole thing with the placement of the captions. And
I saw the original art from that page in Baltimore, and all the other pages are drawn at huge Golden Age comics era sizes, but this one is tiny because it's just a photostat.
I've seen various versions of this page, so I think Will might have reworked it over the years.
That could be.
Maybe they lost it.
No, I think Dan's right. I think the original is quite small because the photo is small.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then so the Spirit has to be dragged into the story because it is called the Spirit. So here's the Spirit, running after and fighting some gangsters, while Gerhard Schnabel's decided that he's gonna, now he's grown up, he doesn't care who says what, he's gonna, sick of being humiliated and ignored, he's gonna fly, and sure enough, he flies. But then a bullet inadvertently hits him, and he is dead. Sorry, again, spoiler alert. Sorry if I ruined this 70-year-old story, folks. But and Will always loved it. Why do you guys, any clue? Or I mean, I have some ideas. But what was it about this story that made it Will's favorite?
That was my favorite conclusion in my book, and Jules supported it when he read the book. He got a big kick out of it. My argument is this is the moment in Will's life when he feels like he's flying. He's doing better work than he's ever done before. The strip is being done brilliantly. It's in many ways successful. It's not getting the same notice that traditional newspaper strips got years before. We're just coming out of the era when the newspaper strip cartoonists were true national celebrities. They were movie star equivalents back in the 1920s and the 1930s, when the movies were just beginning to have star power. And he's under emotional pressure to get a real job and grow up. And I to me, my belief is this, that the resonance in this, or the hidden message is, I flew, nobody noticed. The hell with it. I guess I'll go get a real job. And it's not long after this that Will's participation in the strip diminishes as he gets more and more involved in the commercial side of his business, which is more job-like, right? You have customers like the United States Army giving you contracts to produce work. You can turn around, in Will's case, to his father-in-law and say, "See, I'm not just drawing silly pictures."
Well, his father was a successful stockbroker, I believe, right?
Yeah, and his father-in-law, like many father-in-laws in history, was putting a certain amount of pressure to say, come into the real world. You're a bright, talented young man. You could make much more money. You could be more successful. You got a good head on your shoulders. Well, why are you drawing these silly pictures? And you can envision those conversations, which many artists have gone through.
He was offered an opportunity to join the brokerage firm, and Will politely declined. But many years later, if you read his graphic novel, The Name of the Game, in there, he revisits that with, it's basically Anne's story, where she falls in love with a poet, not a cartoonist. And the poet is offered a position in the brokerage firm, and he takes it. And then he turns into a real son of a bitch. So it's Will's what if story.
That's a real savage graphic novel. That's a
Yeah.
So let us proceed ahead. So yes, Will spent. Spirit ends in 1952. Will concentrates on doing comics, largely instructional comics for the U.S. Army, and a lot of corporate stuff and various government stuff. And in 1965, Jules Feiffer puts out a book called The Great Comic Book Heroes. That is the origins and early adventures of the classic superheroes of the comic books in glorious color. It was the first real history book of comics people had seen. First time people of my generation had really seen a lot of these comics. There was no internet or anything like that. There were no collected editions. There were virtually no reprints. So first time, and I think Pfeiffer has said that one of the reasons he did that book was to put the Spirit back on the map. And indeed, there was this Spirit story in The Great Comic Book Heroes. I had never heard of the Spirit before that, but I was intrigued and, waiting, and I guess enough other people were too, because then through Harvey Comics, there was this was at the time of the Batman movie, the Batman TV show, so people were scrambling for any kind of thing that resembled a superhero, and so Harvey put out a couple of issues of reprints, including some very dark stories, like that one about the guy on death row who's getting a haircut. What's that called?
The Barber.
The Barber. That was a chilling story to read at like 12. Holy cow.
Well, at least he could get a haircut, Danny.
Yeah, but he had to kill somebody to get it.
If we go another few weeks, Danny, be the only one.
Could be. And then right around this era, these zany underground comics start coming out. This is Zap Zero. Dennis, what year was Zap?
68, I think.
68. So this is that period, and Will is starting to become conscious of the underground comics and of some guy named Dennis Kitchen. How did you meet Will?
I was at my first Phil Suling convention in 1971. Barely known. There, basically, as a fan looking through comics, when someone told me Will wanted to talk to me, and I was sure they were mistaken, but he was curious what was going on, and he got me in his hotel room and pumped me for information, barely let me ask any questions about his career. And at the time it was puzzling, but later on I realized when I got to know him that he was just always intensely curious about new developments, especially in a field he loved. So it was an important meeting, and it led to our continue to communicate, and ended up publishing his work for many years until Paul started publishing his work for years. So
well, here's some of the covers, a couple of covers of the kitchen sink spirits that Will did new covers for. That's a great point you make about his curiosity. You know, a lot of people in any business, but in comics especially, if they've been doing it for decades, become very complacent and, you know, not just not interested in what the young people are doing, but cynical about it and dismissive of it. Will was just the opposite. This is a classic. This is really...
yeah.
Well, these covers aren't just stiffer versions of what he was doing in the 40s. They're brand new. They've got a totally different energy that rhymes with the originals, but feels totally different.
Yeah.
So that's more or less the end. I just want to go through a little more of Will's career. Of course, so 1978, which is a few years after you met him, Dennis, some touchstones. This Superman movie came out, first Superman movie with Chris Reeve. And that same year, what some people, an early graphic novel type thing, The Silver Surfer. It was not a graphic novel. It was The Ultimate Cosmic Experience by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Joe Sinnott came out. And this is the year that Will came out with a Contract with God, which was not the first graphic novel, but it was the work that popularized that phrase and really put it on the map in a way that hadn't been
The first
done
one to make
before.
a difference is the way I like to put it.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I think the distinction I've come to draw, particularly in teaching courses on graphic novels as literature, is that, take that Silver Surfer book, the longer comics experiments that had happened before were often just longer genre fiction.
Mm-hmm.
They were the same content, the same material. The better ones expanded on it, took advantage of the additional space that was available, maybe told a bigger story. But the dividing line, I think, for what we ought to consider a graphic novel is that they deal with the human condition. And even by that measure, Contract is not the first. I'd argue that the first sort of modern graphic novel would be Harvey Kurtzman's The Jungle Book, maybe roughly 20 years before, I guess.
Yep, 59.
But because Contract took on sexuality, not in a prurient or plumbing sense, but in a real, why is it that people do that fashion? It took on religion and man's relationship with God or spirituality, however you might want to define that. It touched on the human condition on some very direct and powerful ways. And that's the dividing line, I think, that makes something a graphic novel. What is the theme? Is it about something that makes us human, as opposed to a good guys versus bad guys kind of run around and blow up the world story? There's nothing wrong with genre fiction. I've spent most of my life writing it and publishing it. It's really good junk food. My diet has consisted much more of intellectual junk food than it has of intellectually challenging material. But this book came out, it wasn't like what had been done before. It was beautifully produced. Will subsidized the production of it very quietly, got a real book publisher to do it the way he wanted to do it. And the young creative talent in the field also looked and said, oh my God, that old fart? He's doing this stuff that is breaking the boundaries in ways that we're not. And when you talk to Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman, the brilliant talents who were starting to work in comics or reading comics at that moment, who would revolutionize the field in the next decade, the thing wasn't that it was labeled a graphic novel. The thing was what it accomplished and who accomplished it. If an old guy can step up and do something that is so removed from what has been done before, we shouldn't just be flipping hamburgers. We should be trying to make a gourmet meal also. And whether that came out in Frank's issues of Daredevil that followed that, which were not a graphic novel in the sense of physically being a graphic novel, but begin to deal with all of those kinds of subject matter, or the graphic novels that they each got to do over the course of the next batch of their years. There's a very direct domino-like causality going on here. A fan named Richard Kyle had come up with the term a graphic novel close to a decade, more than a decade, before Eisner used it on that cover. A number of people had used something resembling that as a label for works they were producing. Nobody had used it quite so blatantly on a book that was a real book and that did all of this. And no one knew the backstory of how much this reflected the tragedy in Will's own life and the emotional fire that gave the work at the time. But you felt it when you read it. You felt that this was a work of passion. This wasn't what comics were. It wasn't what we had been before. It was somehow transcendent, and that opened the door.
And it somehow ties into sort of Will, dragging Dennis to grill him about comics, because kind of Will, I think, saw the undergrounds and knew that he wasn't going to do anything as extreme as that, but he saw that there was that somewhere there was an audience for comics that weren't just guys in spandex punching each other. And I guess Dennis, and probably everybody he talked to at that convention and that period was him sort of gathering information. So
sorry, Dennis, please.
No, go ahead.
Well, for all the incredible talent that was going on in the underground comic scene at the time, none of them were Will Eisner. Like the idea of somebody bringing all of this experience, like as an artist, as a businessman, as a producer, and then just as a man who had lived through the first half of the 20th century to the independent comic scene, like a young guy couldn't have made contact with God. Right. It needed to be this old head coming back, bringing the weight of him to it.
And he also needed to be a guy who had success in his own business so that he didn't have to keep cranking out pages of whatever to make a living, but he could kind of sit back and reflect and figure out this thing to do. Because he's a guy, right? He's quoted first in 1941, I think, in a Philadelphia paper referring to comics as an art form. And I was just reading, apparently when he went back to his studio, after that, everybody, read the article and made fun of him for like being so highfalutin and talking about comics as capital A art. So
don't underestimate the ingredient that the pain was, though.
I bet.
You have a man who had an incredible success. This is a guy who was selling newspapers as a kid on the streets in New York. He was a poor immigrant family. He managed to finish high school. College was unthinkable. He was out earning a living. He went from that. He was derided to some extent by his father-in-law for not having a real job, and he had gone on to become the CEO of a public company. make a lot of money several different ways. He had the white picket fence house with the wonderful wife, 2 kids, and then his daughter dies, and his son loses it over that, and the white picket fence world has gone to crap.
His daughter is 16 when she dies, right?
Yeah. Alice was 16. John was, I think, 18.
Yep.
A couple of years older, and he couldn't deal with the trauma of his sister dying, and that cascaded his life into deep trouble for a lifetime. This was a man who had had everything, and in many ways had lost everything, and that pain comes through in this work, right? He doesn't, when he's drawing Fremy Hirsch, he's drawing himself, and he's screaming at God. And we didn't know that, but we felt that. And you're right, Dan, that all those years of experience, all the skill that you could bring to bear on it, he couldn't have done when he was in his 20s. And I'd like to think that none of us did the work in our 20s that we were capable of doing later. But very few creative people take all of the things that they've learned, all of the skills they've accumulated, and ratchet up in this kind of fashion. Pain is a powerful stimulus. And I don't wish that Will and Ann had gone through that hell for obvious reasons. They're both terrific people.
And Dan's just realizing he has to suffer a lot before he does his great.
You know, think about the choices, Dan.
I'm weighing.
But yeah, and we've been flipping through images of Will did over the next between Contract with God and 78 and the next 25 or more years, he must have done a graphic novel or more a year, and we've been going through some of them, a lot of them memoirs of his youth, and he sort of wanted to be kind of the Saul Bellow or the Bernard Malamud of comics, and I mean I think he achieved it. But this is there's a Will as a kid entertaining the neighborhood kids by drawing Lindy's Airplane, which of course was the spirit of St. Louis. I don't know if that was in the back of his mind later on. And then so Will drew many graphic novels about his childhood, about the Jewish experience in New York and in America. And at the end of his life, he became very concerned about anti-Semitism and what he saw as a resurgence of it, and specifically about the return of this fraudulent document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this was literally what he was working on, the week before he died, was finishing this graphic novel.
No, he finished it. It was published after he died, but it was finished. Right. What he was working on when he died was the third educational book, The Expressive Anatomy.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. And we've skipped, the guy had so many careers, we've skipped the educational part. But so as we, I think we're sort of getting into the home stretch, and I want to have some more time for some questions. Dan, this is some of your work on the spirit. How did a young guy like you get so interested in Will to the point of wanting to draw the spirit?
When I was a teenager, I liked a lot of dumb stuff, and and I got the DC Femme Fatale collection of spirit stories, the soft cover, and it was just like, oh, you can tell different kinds of stories, and there's kind of no going back to it after that, because it wasn't just that you could talk about serious stuff, but you didn't have to be so serious about it all the time.
That's interesting.
And so I really gravitated to Eisner. This is the test page I did to work on the spirit. Dynamite apparently didn't want me for the book because I was too Eisner-y. But Matt Wagner, who's writing the book, and his son Brennan, who was coloring and who really lobbied for me, just thought I was the guy, and I guess we wore him down.
That's a good thing. That's cool. Did you ever meet Will?
I never met him. He died when I was about 14.
So this is beautiful stuff, and this is, I mean, it's just nice to see somebody doing the spirit, with such passion, and yet another generation. This is not you. This is an 80th anniversary book that came out from. I'm blanking on the press. Anybody remember the name of it? It's Clover Press. Clover Press. This is available now. This is with an Eisner cover. So this, if you want to celebrate Will's 80th in style, this would be the book to buy.
It's a good collection. All the stories in it are preceded by essays by different people about the. It's a good buy.
Thank you. This is good to know. We talked about, this is Pfeiffer. These are a series did a trilogy of graphic novels. The first one is called Kill My Mother, and you can see it's the Pfeiffer take on Eisner. Everybody wears fedoras like the spirit, and there's even one panel. I mean, the third book in the trilogy especially is a complete. I don't want to give it away because that is fairly recent, but there's so much homaging Eisner in the spirit. But this character refers to my father, Dennis Colt Hannigan, came to this country dirt poor, and of course the spirit's secret identity, quote unquote, was Denny Colt. This is something that Pfeiffer did for an exhibition that Dennis and I co-curated 9 years ago for Will Eisner in New York, and this is the spirit as a Pfeiffer dancer, having just knocked out a bad guy with a gun, which was amazing. We went to Jules's house out at that point out in Southampton, I think, and Jules was looking for the thing he had meant to give us, but he couldn't find it. So while we sat there, he just drew this and said, "Here, use this in the exhibition." That was one of the more amazing things I've ever seen.
Wow.
This is now we're plugging both. Will, this is the Contract with God Curators Collection what came out under your imprint at Dark Horse, right, Dennis?
Yeah, John Lind and I put this together. One volume is the pencil art shot from the originals, and the other is the finished ink art, along with commentary and essays.
And it's awesome.
Well, and you get, what I love about it is you get to see how Will changed his mind and altered, sometimes eliminated full pages and dialogue. It gives you a little more insight into his creative process, which would otherwise never be seen by anyone outside an archive.
Oh, beautiful. It's an amazing collection. This is Will apparently did, not apparently, but he did the inking on vellum. Right? In other words, instead of putting ink on the pencil pages, he did it on a vellum overlay. So the pencils and the inks exist separately for Contract with God.
Yeah, it's the only time he did that. And as a result, we get to see the before and after. I think at the time he thought it would be easier to ink over the pencils. I don't know. He never did it again. And
I'll do this one shot. It's like Al Jaffe doing one fold in 1964, going, "Well, that was a good idea. What next?" Right? Dan, this is your current or upcoming project.
Yeah, this is my comic on Webtoon, Lavender Jack. It's like a PJ Wodehouse superhero story. It's been going for 2 years. We're on the second season, and it actually was nominated for an Eisner last year and a Ringo.
Very cool. Congratulations.
I'm very excited because we have a lot of younger readers on Webtoon, and they're like discovering more classic American cartooning stuff through Lavender Jack, which is really exciting.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you for carrying it on. And this, Paul, here's your book, Champion of the Graphic Novel. Any,
As mentioned before.
yeah.
Warehouse full of them, guys.
So
Go
you
for
can probably get a deal. And this is my subtle way of building up to a plug for my own book. This is actually a still from a series called The Comic Book Greats that Stan Lee hosted in the early 90s. And here's Stan and Will talking comics. And by an amazing coincidence, there's the cover of my book with its very subtle red cover. A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. So it is available. Amazon has a very good price on it, but I'm sure your local independent shop, or if you're dying to get the audiobook, that's available too. There is Will as an older person. So that might be the Will Eisner a lot of you saw at conventions or in documentaries. And that is the end of the presentation. So I can take us out of screen share mode. I'm going to stop the share. Travis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're back. Uh-oh. What do I got to do? All
We're
right.
fine. We're fine, Danny. Just out of time.
There we go. Okay. And yeah, I guess let me just, I'll wrap up with one question. I guess what was it about the spirit and about Will that we are here talking about it 80 years later? If anybody has a succinct thought on that, I'd love to hear it.
I think by definition of its 80th birthday, it's proving to be timeless. People are still reading it. It's still an influence. It's still amazing to look at. The best of the spirit is basically the best of comics. And the fact that Will had other careers after the spirit is all the more amazing, that he continued to innovate and experiment and actually continue to get better. It's an astonishing career.
Thanks. Dan, any thoughts from the younger generation? Hate to keep picking on you as the young guy, but
Well, I mean, the spirit, it's Taxi Driver. It's the first great influential work of a tremendous American talent. And I think that what carries it on all these years later is the like not only the quality of it, because it's funny, it's very human, it's frequently like heartbreaking, but it's also you can just see all this potential energy in it. Trying out different things, playing with different colors, and you, especially if you know Will's later output, you just see the beginnings of it, and there's something really electric about that.
thank you. You're not saying that Denny Colt is Travis Bickle, are you?
No, although De Niro would not have been bad.
That's true. Thank you. And Paul, any?
I think it's always important to look at the turning points. And Will is extraordinarily rare in having created two of the turning points in a field 40 years apart, basically, almost 40 years apart. Most of us don't get to break ground ever. And I'm hard-pressed to think of anyone who broke ground that radically twice at that kind of gap. The reason I was proud of doing the archives is so much of the material that's in that enables you to look back and see this is where the vernacular of comics matured. We moved from the newspaper strip, which even on the Sunday page was so constrained, to we were just beginning to move to the story. And Will and the team that worked with him brought in so many new elements from cinematography, from literature, to telling a story that we now take for granted. We now have a name for a kind of shot that he used there that we can throw in our art direction when we're working with an artist. But here's those first, sometimes stumbling, sometimes magnificent steps to it. And in the same fashion with Contract, when you look at it again there for the graphic novel, here's a departure point. Those are historic moments, and those deserve preservation. Those deserve being looked at, not just academically, but it's great to hear Dan talk about it as someone who is earlier in his career than us gray-haired, shaggy types, able to look at it and take inspiration and say, wait a minute, I see in this the energy of a young person's courage and the discovery, and I see things that inspire me to craft. That's why we keep looking at Will's work, and that's why we want to keep putting it in front of young, creative people, writers, artists, cartoonists, filmmakers, to say, this is the art of the possible.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Travis Langley, who's behind the scenes, making this all work technically. And thank you, Will Eisner and the Spirit. So everybody, be well, stay well. That's you guys and everybody in the audience. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And thank you.
Thanks, Danny.
So much.